evening. I'm Raymond Richard Neutra, and this evening we're going to be following my father, Richard Neutra, and my mother, Dione Neutra, as they become voluntary Americans. You see them here at age 30 for my father and age 21 for my mother on their wedding day in December 1922. We'll be talking about what that choice made possible for them. We'll be talking about the rather unusual reasons that they had for becoming Americans and some of the influences in Europe which led to those unusual reasons. And then we'll be doing some readings from letters between them and from them to my grandparents about what it was like to become an American in the 1920s. But first I want to give you a picture of these two people and their relationship from a memory of my own 60 years ago. It's Easter vacation in the early 1950s, and my mother, who controls the calendar, has noticed that my dad has some free time and that we are going to use that Easter vacation to drive up from Los Angeles to the northern border of California that they've never done before. And well into that trip, we're at the top of the ridge above Fort Ross, above San Francisco, and my mother is driving. She's driving the Nash Rambler, which was purchased because it had a seat that went down into a bed. And my father had had a heart attack a couple of years before, was told by the doctors at the time that he shouldn't be driving anymore. And my mother, characteristically, willingly took on the job of chauffeur. My dad and I are lying flat on this bed with our heads on a pillow, looking out backwards out the back window of the car as we are winding down a dirt road through the Cruz Rhododendron Preserve. And we are driving under clouds of white rhododendron, the tires crunching on the gravel under the road. And when we get to the bottom of the grade at the Pacific Coast Highway, we stop, sit up, and look at each other. My father has tears in his eyes. This is the sensitive artist, Richard Neutra, the one who is capable of doing this beautiful watercolor of a Muslim house in Bosnia, where he spent the First World War, or this rather anguished self-portrait at the same time, stuck in the First World War when he really wanted to be in the United States, as he had decided before the war began. Then, 200 miles north, another aspect of my dad is illustrated, and their relationship. We've been out on a peninsula above Arcata with a beautiful little bay and a wonderful wooded area, and there is a sign saying no trespassing private property. And curious, my dad gets us to stop at a gas station, and he goes inside, and then we see him go to the aluminum and glass phone booth, go inside and start riffling through the phone book and making phone calls. My mom and I are waiting in the car. After a while, he comes out with a big grin on his face and leans over the driver's window and says to my mother, "Ja, Dione, where do you think we're going to be tonight?" And my mother smiling back saying, "Ja, Richard, where are we going to be spending tonight?" He said, "We're going to be at the Whispering Pines Hotel in Lake Tahoe." And why, Richard, are we going to be at the Lake Tahoe? Because the Chevrolet dealers are meeting there. And why, Richard, do we want to go where the Chevrolet dealers are? Because that is where Carl Smith, who owns the local Chevrolet dealership, is going to be, and he owns that property, and I'm going to go there to make him a business proposition. And so we pull out the map of California, see that it's possible to drive over the Trinity Alps to Redding and then down through Chico, where the almond blossoms are probably in bloom, and make it to Lake Tahoe. So that's the go-getter Richard Neutra that we see in this picture, putting on the charm to LBJ and Linda Bird Johnson. So indeed, we arrive in Lake Tahoe at the hotel, and my father makes a beeline to the convention center, where he quickly acquaints himself with all the vagaries of selling Chevrolets in Northern California. And he gets to the hotel room, calls up Mr. Smith on the phone, and explains that he's the famous architect Richard Neutra, and that he wants to invite Mr. Smith for breakfast because he has a business deal to propose to him. And the next morning, indeed, we have breakfast with Mr. Smith, and my dad pulls out his wallet with a little laminated card with his image on the front of Time magazine, and he explains just how famous he is to Mr. Smith, and pulls out his portfolio and suggests that they develop this land in the most wonderful way. Mr. Smith says he'll get back to my dad, which he never does. But there was an example of several of these for every one of the 300 projects that my dad designed. And my mother was up for this, for the adventure and for the unpredictability of it and the interest of all these adventures with this entertaining man who could charm the birds out of the trees when he was in his manic phase. So what were the skills that this man had, in addition to this artistic sensitivity and the ability to work 24/7 and to engage people and to communicate with them? He had great skills as an engineer, as a project manager, which he had to deploy when he built his first famous building, the Lovell Health House, the first steel skeleton residence in the United States with gunite concrete sides. He had a tremendous sense of economic and cultural history. He was a pamphleteer and a great communicator. So he came with a lot of skills and very well educated in the United States. And with those skills, America made possible a number of significant accomplishments that we'll just pass over really quickly. So what America made possible, just to summarize a long career, the first big accomplishment was a book that he wrote back to Germany called Wie baut Amerika, How Builds America. And it described how skyscrapers were put together, the big American firms with hundreds of draftsmen, things that were just very exotic for Europeans. And it was a bestseller in Europe, in Japan, in South America. And then over a 40-year period, there were radical experiments in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and mature productions in the 50s and 60s, more than 300 projects. He wrote a book called Survival Through Design that described the role of physiology in understanding aesthetics and healthy building. He designed the first modern school in 1935, in 1936, a plywood prefabricated house. The 1946 Kaufmann House set a whole trend for mid-century modern architecture, the first use of aluminum vertical louvers in the United States. Houses like the Moore House in Ojai in the early 50s, radical indoor-outdoor kind of integration of nature. The Los Angeles Hall of Records in the early 60s with hundreds of foot high aluminum louvers that followed the sun with an electronic eye. A drive-in church for Reverend Schuler, the same man who then built the Crystal Cathedral with Philip Johnson. And then with my brother Dione, rebuilt the home that I grew up in that had burned in 1963. And we see my father sitting on the roof deck of that house looking out over the water pool that cooled the house and also linked visually with Silver Lake across the road. My mother, Dione Neutra, of course, was a wife and companion, a sounding board, executive assistant, diarist. She handled all the public relations with the magazines and maintained good relationships with their editors all over the world. A hostess and cultivator of friendship in a new culture. And after my father died, someone who, as a musician, self-published a record of her songs as a leader singer, and she translated and published a book of the letters between my father and herself between 1920s and 30s. Some of those letters we're going to be reading today. And secondly, and I use the word advisedly, she was the mother of 3 sons, of which I was the youngest by 12 years, and the care of her oldest son, who had autism and created a great deal of sorrow for her and my father. And she had a most wonderful way of embracing age gracefully and died in our home at age 89. So when did my father decide to come to America? He wanted to follow his older friend, R.M. Schindler, for a study tour in the United States prior to World War I, when everything was looking very rosy in Europe. But he was caught in World War I, so he only realized his plan in 1923. And we see here a snapshot he took of his artillery unit on their horses hauling artillery up some hillside in Bosnia. So it was unlike Mies van der Rohe and unlike Gropius, who came in the late 1930s as professionally established refugees to academic posts. Now he had goals for visiting America that he fulfilled. First, he wanted to see what his mentor and teacher, Adolf Loos, in Vienna had seen when Loos was in New York and Chicago, and that was these new Americans, the ones who came and dropped all their bad old habits and rigid thinking and were willing to try anything to advance in America. And he wanted to meet the great Louis Sullivan, who had been the first skyscraper architect. He wanted to work with his idol, Frank Lloyd Wright, and he wanted to report back to Europe on American know-how. And he did all of those things. But he had some other goals which were very interesting but unfulfilled in America. He wanted to find a way to do for housing with American factory know-how what Henry Ford had done for the automobile. This notion that someone with a factory could make even poor people possible to have a car. Why couldn't this be done for housing, for schools, and for other socially important buildings? And he thought that if you could be doing this with large factories, that you would be able to afford sociologists and physiologists and human factors people so that you could design these structures so that they were healthy for human beings and based on good research. And he wanted to see it was affordable for everyone. And he wanted to focus on the clientele that we see in this picture from Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, the poorest of the poor who were living in slums in large cities in the United States and Europe. So it was a different clientele than the middle class clientele that most architects tended to work for. But this dream really didn't come to fruition because it was swimming upstream from the American libertarian political ethos. And really only in the West, in the deserts of Nevada and Wyoming and California and Arizona, do you see these kinds of factory-built trailers where poor people live. But there it's a market solution to the housing problem. And of course, they don't reflect all of the kind of design wisdom that my father might have brought to it, although it would be interesting to study how much some of these ideas have crept into trailer design. So why would my father have these unusual goals in coming to the United States? And there are three worldviews that influence these goals, three worldviews from Europe. One of them was Otto Wagner's design school in Vienna. The other one was the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright from the United States. And the other was the influence of the Deutsche Werkbund. And I'll talk about all three of those. Otto Wagner took over the head of the Academy of Fine Arts Architecture School in 1894 when my dad was 2 years old, and left it in 1912 when my dad was 20. And he developed a problem-oriented curriculum that emphasized the use of new technology and new materials and exploiting their capabilities, advocated systems thinking and city planning and concern for a wide range of building types, not just monumental buildings. And he, Otto Wagner, believed that should be no single style that would come out of this, but each new building problem would develop its own style. And when Otto Wagner discovered Frank Lloyd Wright in 1911, he brought the publication to his students and said, "This architect is a man who's a better architect than I am." It's a kindred spirit we're seeing here.
At least 3 or 4 architects who had a great influence on me at a very early age. At the earliest age, it was Otto Wagner, who was a contemporary of Louis Sullivan. As to his architecture, it is probably the European equivalent of what Frank Lloyd Wright did here, or Sullivan before him.
We see here an example of Otto Wagner's 1908 Postal Savings Bank, radical building with those aluminum heat vents, exposed steel beams. The stone cladding was bolted onto the structure to show that it was not a solid masonry building, but was a new kind of building with new materials. And the kind of student projects that were being done there, as exemplified by this one by R.M. Schindler in 1913, were radically modern. And my father walked down the street from where he was studying at the Viennese equivalent of the MIT, and saw what Rudolf Schindler was doing and was excited by it, and got to know Schindler and discovered him again in the cafe talking to Adolf Loos, and they became good friends, and he was excited to learn what his friend was doing in Chicago in 1913, and as I said, wanted to follow him. Now, what Rudolf Schindler was doing in 1913 led to what he did in 1921, well before the Dessau Bauhaus was built, and well before any of the other modernists were doing their things. This radical and very interesting structure at Kings Road in Los Angeles. And of course, my father was aware of that too. Le Corbusier in 1913 was building something that was far from modern. And Mies van der Rohe in 1913 was building sort of a neoclassicist kind of a building. So that the Viennese Otto Wagner school was capable of modern thoughts well before similar things were being done in Germany. Although Gropius had done the Fagus factory work in 1911, but it's different than what Schindler and Neutra ultimately did. Now, the other influence was Japan and Frank Lloyd Wright. Here we see a picture of a building which is not mid-century California. This building was built when Sir Isaac Newton was a baby in 1640. Radical penetration of interpenetration of indoors and outdoors, horizontality, a completely different look than the European one towards nature. And then came Wright's 1911 Wasmuth portfolio that you see me holding in this picture. There are not many of them left. This particular one is in the Getty Museum and was Lloyd Wright's copy. Lloyd had done some of the drawings in this for his father on a trip to Fiesole, Italy. And the drawings inside this portfolio, which were self-published by Wright in Berlin by the publisher Wasmuth, were simplified from the colored drawings and paintings that had been done by Marion Mahoney, so that they were simplified. And Lloyd Wright thought that the more scaled down European modernism was partly influenced by this simplification. And you see here the 1908 Gale house of Oak Park of Frank Lloyd Wright, where with the great overhangs, nature on the balconies. It's not a box, but a series of planes and intersecting horizontal and vertical planes. And this came as dynamite to my father and R.M. Schindler, as it did to Gropius and Mies and Le Corbusier, who were then working in Peter Barron's office and took the day off to look at this thing like from Mars. It had a tremendous impact in Europe, both in Vienna and in Holland and in Berlin. The Wagner Villa of 1912 that we can see shows some of that influence already, but it is still a box placed in a garden, and very different from this a picture of the Neutra studio residences where I grew up on the second floor, where the living room just flows out onto the balcony. The ceiling just shoots out into the landscape, and both the near landscape and the borrowed landscape. Then this other big influence was the Deutsche Werkbund, started by Hermann Muthesius and a number of other artists, much influenced by the British arts and crafts movement with its concern about the spiritual relationship between people and the things they made. With the arts and crafts, they thought that this would be achieved by returning to the medieval arts and crafts. Also a big influence by Ebenezer Howard and the garden movement of bringing gardens into the city. Influenced by Frederick Taylor and the scientific management movement in the United States that allowed Henry Ford to build those factories that could make cars that anybody could afford. Many of the significant sociologists and artists and architects were arguing about how could you do this in the era where things were being made by factories and not by medieval craftsmen. And how could you have a relationship to these factory-built things which was different from the keeping up with the Joneses and the conspicuous consumption, but had an authentic relationship to well-designed things. And finally, some of the German members of the Werkbund formed the Bauhaus in 1919 after World War I, and then moved to Dessau and built the famous building there in Dessau in 1926 or 27. So we're going to get now to reading some letters from my father to my mother and my father to my mother's mother, which describe his attitude to the proper goals for design. And in the photograph that I have here, we see a bottle of wine, we see a corkscrew, and we see a glass. And I showed the bottle of wine to illustrate the notion that there's some things that we buy for their physiological effect, not for how they look. We buy wine because of what it does to our taste buds and to our olfactory nerve and for the buzz that it gives us. The corkscrew, on the other hand, we buy for how it performs, not how it looks, although this particular one looks pretty good also. And then there are other things that we buy primarily for how they look, like fashionable clothes and this wine glass. My father, in these letters that we're about to read, is talking about physiological effect and talking about performance and talking about them with enthusiasm. A well-designed house affects our entire sense of space. It is composed of many ingredients, as I explained to you on one of our walks. A sense of smell, of touch, of hearing, of temperature, and the eye. Also an obscure sense for materials. This sense guesses whether a third dimension is filled with green cottage cheese or green marble, even if the surface appears to be similar. A current of air, a draft, a breeze felt when strolling through the gallery of a cloister or the rising air in the dome of Milan. The exhalation of plaster, stone, heated by the sun, a musty basement, or underground water odor in a crypt. The reverberation of my steps, the echo from tapestries or flagstones. The faint, steady stream of air through a perforated tower. All this affects the heart more than a view. The well of a staircase in Genoa can be magnificent, but never so in a photograph, in a drawing. A space affects the senses three-dimensionally, not as pitifully drawn on a flat surface. A garden, too, is a space. 100 objects look beautiful on a photograph, 1,000 others are different in reality. An apple tree, seen while ascending a path on a certain spot, 5 meters before climbing over a summit, can be a greater mystery than all ghosts taken together. What is it that moves one so deeply every time one reaches that certain spot? And then here in this letter, he writes to my mother and to her mother, who he addresses in the Swiss diminutive of Mütterli, little mother. And he's writing about a set of plans that he's doing for an Englishman in Vienna who works with the Quakers who are handing out food there to the starving children. Your letter gave me enormous pleasure. Now come with me and let's look at the plans. Thus, windowsill to be wide, the lower part of the window frame high to accommodate a bottle with a stopper, so that when opening the window it does not have to be removed. How shall we treat the surface? Where do you want to put the flower pots and water them? Perhaps with sheet metal and gravel over it. Or what else? Oh, Mütterli, I shall be so glad to consider a sewing room. Does one absolutely sew more often during winter than summer? Mütterli, I expected that you would criticize the position of the range. Very good. The light influx is bad, but how you positioned it is no better. Also, the swing of the door is unfavorable and might bother the cook, even if opening the door into the dining room, which surely would be incorrect. Furthermore, kitchen odors would invade the dining room. There is no vent. Don't you like a freestanding range? Is my drain board much too far from the dining room? It is impossible to have the toilet door open directly into this much used hall. The wardrobe must be situated between entrance door and hall on account of winter weather. The writing desk must never be placed in such a way that the writer has a door at his back, and thus an entering visitor can surprise him. Dear Mütterli and Dione, it is true that a grand piano could suffer if placed alongside a badly insulated wall. However, as you have placed it now, the player cannot see his score as he faces the bright window. The wide, low couch is wonderful, darling Mitterly. I put a blanket over you, assuming you have already removed your shoes. The dining room might not get enough light if you place a covered, glazed porch in front of it. A modern dining room must be light and not dark like a Gothic one. To be sure, I would love to enjoy the morning sun in your porch at breakfast. But Mitterly, such a long bench has its drawbacks when everybody has to rise and strain to make room for a latecomer. For the one sitting comfortably opposite on a chair, this must be a comical sight. To place the older portly ladies on the chairs prevents the younger girls to give a hand, jump up to get the forgotten bread if they sit squeezed in between others. Where do we place the lady of the house? Such a cozy dining corner with bench cries out for a sedate mistress of the house. No? Or is it just right for a young and lovely one? Oh, Mitterly, one could make the cushion covers so colorful that they cry out for a children's party. My father and Eric Mendelsohn received a prize for a design that they'd done for a library in Haifa, Israel. And with that money, my father gave notice to Mendelsohn and finally was able to realize his dream to come to the United States. In October of 1923, he wrote to my mother, who had stayed behind, pregnant with my older brother Frank, until such time as my father had secured a job. Dear Dione, today, October 24th, I really am in New York. Yesterday, and even the day before, a terrible storm developed. The ship lay more and more on its side, sometimes 45 degrees. Everything movable crashed noisily against the slippery railing while the rain poured down horizontally. Huge, long, and broad breakers moved like a jagged theater decoration, one after another into the milky white foggy mist, smoked 1,000 white fine sprays of foam skyward with every convulsive upward thrust of air. The water had the appearance of boiling sulfur. The ship tilted frighteningly in this Poseidon-like hubbub. An old lady tried to reach her cabin, fell down, took hold of me and a passing steward. All three of us stumbled into a heap of chairs piling up on the railing. Despite my efforts, the lady fell on her face. Suddenly on the left, a quarter mile away, a tanker loomed above the foaming waves, its course in a right angle towards us. Even I could determine that it was a tanker as I recognized the position of its smokestack. Due to our slanting position, it seemed as if the other ship, looked at from below, was descending on us down the turbulent water slope with a bullet-like rapidity. Our siren bellowed signals. One could see white vapor pour out of the other ship's foghorn without any sound whatsoever reaching us. Both ships maneuvered against the storm, stopped, honked, staggered against the frenzied horizon. The Laconia executed a huge curve, and the dancing tanker disappeared in the fog. I continue my account. During the night, the boat behaved in a most erratic manner. Finally, I lay down, fully dressed, and slept until midnight. Then I undressed and slept until the dawn broke. We had already passed the canal between Long Island and Staten Island. The fog was thinner, the sea had quieted down. Now started a counting and maltreatment of passengers, interrupted by breakfast, but most annoyingly continued in New York. On account of the fog, we could hardly see anything of the imposing entrance of New York. The Statue of Liberty was merely a shadow against the fog. When we arrived at the Cunard Pier, we had to pass a lengthy immigration control in the dining room. The unusual cut of my military overcoat helped me again to get through easily. Thus, one enters a new part of the world in turmoil, hardly even noticing it. Then came a thorough customs control. My roll of drawings evoked an unusual and lengthy inspection. Well, I took the streetcar and went as far as Union Square. From there I went on foot to Mr. Seipelman, with whom I have quarters. I climbed a steep, rather dilapidated stairway to the fourth floor, was received and immediately recognized by Mr. Seipelman. To describe this man is the opposite from easy, and his surroundings seem to be made of the same stuff. Beforehand, I should mention that my friend Henry Menkes told me later, Seipelman's soul is made of pure crystal, and I believe him. If one dares making a comparison between a soul of gelatin-like consistency and the rigidity of crystals. Herewith, a floor plan of Seipelman's apartment. The corridor is very dark. Around the round walnut table in the living room are grouped an assortment of well-built but rather old leather-covered easy chairs. Dilapidated sliding windows, as seems usual here, seem not very stable. The blue-green oil paint in the breakfast room is peeling off in large patches. My first impression is one of poverty and neglect, without benefit of a housewife. Seipelman greeted me without a collar, in short sleeves, with peculiarly upturned shoes of old vintage. He is perhaps 1.38 meters in height. He is a tiny man with long straight nose underneath a gray mustache. And my father goes on to describe the fact that Seipelman was a singer in vaudeville, and his children, who had other employment but were musical, also came in for a birthday and jumped up and down from the piano singing to each other, to my father's amazement. His first day in America with the New Americans. He now writes in November in 1929 that he has gotten his first job. I'm telling you of my first job, pronounced job. The situation is as hard as I imagined it, and it is difficult to figure in 3/8 inches. To subtract 9 foot 10 inches from 13 foot 8 inches, for instance, is cumbersome, more than in the metric system. At the same time, all sorts of technical expressions whirl around my ears, as well as office jargon of regular English words, often incorrectly pronounced, according to the ideas of blue-blooded Americans too, spoken by many foreigners who make up 70% of New York's population. Mrs. Toplitz, our friend, speaks by far the most cultivated English. On top of all of this, my boss, Mr. Short, is a terrible squabbler. He is very impatient and shouts around. Short's wrathful eruptions are mainly in 3-minute intervals, directed towards his 2 oldest draftsmen, who really must be pitied. Nothing is done fast enough. There's no time for even the most crucial explanations. The 2 commissions we're working on have not yet been awarded, and so my employment is explicitly temporary. The floor plans of these clubhouses may have advantages. As yet, I do not understand enough of American club life, but they look very haphazard to me, thrown together without regard for structural necessities or light influx. Regarding all the above-mentioned difficulties, Henry estimated that I would receive a weekly wage of $15. Thus, it was a very agreeable surprise when Short granted me, without ado, a wage of $30. Thus, I have so far earned $35 in America. Everything is somewhat easier, as I have no other aim but to prolong my employment from one day to the other and use this opportunity to acquire a little knowledge of technical English. On the other hand, Short's character traits complicate the situation. So far, he treats me with a certain respect, probably because Henry told him how independently I worked. My wife, Peggy Bauhaus, yes, Bauhaus, will read a letter that describes my mother's state of mind while she was waiting back in Hagen, Germany.
This is Dione writing to Josephine, who is Richard's sister in Vienna, in November 1923. And she's writing about their separation now. Fate has been kind to me. It has always provided time for periods of reflection. When I first met Richard, I was very young and had no understanding of his art, which is so intertwined with his personality. Sometimes I find it uncanny that I could have loved him from the start without knowing him at all. When we could be together in Vienna, I experienced my first eye-opener. Afterwards, in Niederweningen, I had the most wonderful peace and quiet. I could digest all the various impressions and learn slowly that Richard was not only a man who loved me very much, but before all else, an artist with inner obligations. Never to forget this was my evening's prayer. I also realized that his character was such that he might omit certain decisions vital to his career out of deference for me. Never to permit this was my firm resolve. I had to learn to be an efficient housewife, learn to be self-sufficient, and not burden him with household chores. I needed time to recognize this, and it was my good fortune to be allowed to do so. Also, my initiation from girlhood to wifehood was so gradual that it will remain a blessing, I believe, throughout our whole lives. During our 3 months together in Berlin, I had a chance to see whether I was capable of enduring Richard's periods of depression, as well as the ups and downs of his profession. Whether I possessed the necessary counterbalance and cheerful disposition required. Afterwards, I again had a whole summer in which to become clear about the future I would face as Richard's wife. Don't think that this was then so clear in my mind. I see it only now. Presently, I again have time to digest the experiences of my first year of marriage and to think how I can improve. Also to realize what it will mean to be a mother. With one child, it will not be so hard, but with several children, it would be difficult not to lose oneself in household chores. I must always keep in mind that first and foremost, I am Richard's wife and counselor, as he calls me to my great pride, his counselor, and that I shall be alone with him in the end, just as we were alone when we started.
My father then moved to Chicago, and he writes in March of 1924, I'm now in Chicago. My life in Hull House is very interesting. I've met Jane Addams. Maybe I will start a drawing class in white and black in the Children's Art School. However, I may not be able to stay here because I live in the room of a gentleman who's traveling at the moment. Here in Chicago, horrible nude figures and tasteless obscenities are on posters on every corner and wall. However, of greatest importance are the murders. 2, no 3 girl slayers are on the daily agenda. The horrified mothers are besieged by reporters who snatch baby pictures out of their hands. It must be very sad to be the mother of a girl slayer, especially in Chicago. The murderers are being photographed from all sides. They either lie about their involvement or commit suicide. Mrs. Toplitz told me that most crimes are committed by first-generation Americans born here. They appear to be the worst. My father had the luck of landing a job with Hollybird and Roach, one of the biggest architectural firms in Chicago, which was then working on the very complex Palmer House series of stores and hotels. And he wrote in his autobiography about Chicago and that employment in the following way. During the 80s and 90s, a wave of structural originality swept Chicago. Big office buildings sprang up together with bigger and better stockyards. Some 42 railroad companies converged on Chicago and turned it into a doormat to all parts of the continent. The railroads wiped their sooty shoe soles on its citizenry, but they made it a junction for trade, a junction for salesmen, politicians, country yokels, and combination ticket holders. One couldn't get through Chicago without spending at least 3 hours there, changing depots and passing downtown department stores and girly shows. In one account of this strangely motivated metropolis, I compared Chicago with 16th century Nuremberg. Neither are natural ports like New York or Antwerp. Both are solely dependent on man-made intersections of commercial routes. The big architectural offices especially had at one time a character of native originality similar to the cities. If one looks at the Reliance Building or at the Monadnock Block, it is obvious that such buildings could not have been designed by anyone who was merely a graduate of any school at that time, anywhere. In the case of mightily gifted John Root, he may have been the chief designer himself. In the case of Halliburtt and Roach, it was clear that neither filled that post, but the firm was surprisingly capable of breeding its own designers, its own engineers, its technological ideas of procedure. An original procedure begets the original product. Such an office was really a training camp for structural talent. These structures had wondrously novel, unheard-of skeletons. They were also wonderful in the method and procedure behind their creation, and in form they were very matter of fact, much as my teacher Adolf Loos had told me. In the field of biologically guided design, there was hardly anything to be learned at Halliburtt and Roach, but I had decided to learn what that firm's experience could teach. I made such tremendous progress in these technical phases that my superiors tended to leave me doing whatever I had acquired. For example, I would detail large restroom toilet groups for months at a time because due to the cumbersome bisexuality of our species, which management could not abolish, there were so many restrooms in the Palmer House that drawing them could last a man for half a year. After a while, I started to detail vertical paths in this building to overcome gravity, elevator shafts. There were plenty of them, too. After some months, I finally succeeded, due to my little linguistic talents and my much greater diligence, in graduating from draftsman number 208 to liaison officer. I worked as a mediator between the various departments on their different floors, and Mr. Polini, the director of design. He had been imported from the Beaux-Arts in Paris and spoke only French. It was really my good luck that I could talk to him in his language and understand his queer trains of design thought. It gave me quite a value in the office. Here, too, architecture was a problem of feeling oneself into others much more than one of purely technical significance. Bosses and galley slave colleagues, code draftsmen and clients are all human beings. Matching individuals is and will be our main issue. My father went out of his way to meet Louis Sullivan and wrote to my mother in May 1924, "Poor Sullivan is dead. I wrote you 2 weeks ago that I had the good idea to visit him, in quotes, at home. Oh my, Graceland Cemetery is a more suitable place than the Warner Hotel was. I'm sure it is not boasting when I tell you that I'm probably the only person in Chicago who daily enjoys his buildings. He was not an achiever, never became as radical as the old Otto Wagner, but he surely was one of the most significant Americans. Correspondingly, his funeral was sad. He had told me, trying to get his breath and quite desolate, what is left of all my endeavors? Nothing. What are the young people doing? Oh my." I met Frank Lloyd Wright at Sullivan's funeral and gave him my condolences. He started to apologize that he had not gotten in touch with me after our correspondence because he was not settled, etc. It does not look promising to me that I can work for him. Wright has the head of a lion resting on a rather well-proportioned body. He looks about 56, is truly a child, but not a well-behaved one. God only knows, he is one in a million. I'm meeting more and more people who believe they know Frank Lloyd Wright. Whomever I start mentioning the modern movement to starts quickly to regale me with scandal stories about him. They must be known all over town and must be juicy morsels for the newspapers. The headlines were a foot high, and people tell me other details of Wright's lack of character. He supposedly left a wife with many children. He seduced another woman with many children, and after he left them in Spring Green, she, her children, and a Negro cook were murdered.
This letter is from Dione to Richard while she's still in Hagen in June 1924, and she's just getting ready to leave on the ship to come to Ellis Island. I've been thinking about the last days and nights in Hagen before you departed. I then had the feeling that we had just started to grow together. For this reason, our long separation is deplorable because in many respects we have to start from scratch. But before all, we are not alone anymore. Have you enough imagination to visualize how constrained we shall be in all our decisions? I shall leave alone on June 10th. And we shall try from the USA to get Frank to come. So she's had the baby, and she's going to leave the baby behind. Or have Mutterly, her mother, visit us and bring Frank. It was very hard for me to leave the child behind, but you are my main consideration, and the boy is in such good hands with Mutterly. He is still so small that he will not miss me. I am determined not to wait any longer. I hope you do not think I am a harsh mother abandoning my child. However, when I contemplate who needs me more, you or the baby, I must admit it is you, it is me, it is us. Our separation was long enough. So here's this young couple parted by this great ocean. So now the next letter I'm going to read is, she's writing to her parents from Ellis Island. And if you have ever visited Ellis Island, as I have, it would have been quite the place for all immigrants to come through. So this was in June 1924. Yesterday evening, we, the unhappy ones who had to stay on board, watched the skyline of New York with its electric advertising signs. Then I took a walk on deck with one of the officers who told me revolting stories about the immorality and shamelessness of women and girls. He has lost his belief that decent women still exist. What he has seen and experienced during his many years at sea begs description. I heard also that we shall sleep 20 in one room on Ellis Island, and there are prisoners, one cannot leave the building, who have been there since December. And this is June. The first instance of decision is a court on Ellis Island. If the court decides negatively, the case goes to Washington, and there the final decision is made. I really am somewhat apprehensive, but hope to get out all right. And then Richard's friend has visited her on the ship, Mrs. Toplitz. Mrs. Toplitz was very nice, but I could hardly understand her. I will try to give this letter to someone so you will have news from me. I am so thankful that the baby, Frank, is not with me. Then she writes that evening, oh, what a blatant contrast. At the moment, I sit with several hundred persons in a dining hall. The food looks so unappetizing that I subsist on coffee and bread. We spend our time in a huge 2-story high hall filled with nationals from all over the world. Most of them, however, are Italian, with a lot of children who scream, run about, and plague their poor mothers. The men, it appears, have to sleep on wooden benches. I do not yet know where we shall sleep. I've tried to play my cello, but shall be unable to practice here. The whole atmosphere is laden with discouragement. Ravishing, beautiful Italian women stare with hollow eyes into the void, wearily repulsing their children. One of them has a 2-month-old baby, which she carries upright, a pitiful sight. Just now I was handed a note saying that Mrs. Toplitz is here, but is not allowed to see me. Richard will come on Sunday. I am so relieved. If anybody can get me out, it will be Richard. However, the court deliberates only on Mondays. Now it's Saturday morning. After a horrible night, I sit again on a bench watching the sunshine through the windows. I just asked one of the servants whether I could help her make up the beds. We get new sheets every day, but this is not permitted. Yesterday at 7 p.m., 14 of us were shut into our room, which had adjacent toilet facilities. There were 7 double-decker beds. Others sleep 70 to 100 in a big hall. And all this would have been bearable if one of the children, who apparently was hungry, had not screamed until 2 a.m. We also have mice. At 5:30 a.m. we are awakened by the mice. What sense does that make? I am so glad that Frank is not with me. So then the next letter I'm going to read is after Richard he's come from Chicago to the court hearing at Ellis Island and convinced the immigration judges that he could support his wife, which was the whole way to get him out of Ellis Island. And then they've left to visit Frank Lloyd Wright, where Richard has been wanting to work, in Spring Green, Wisconsin, at his estate, Taliesin. July, so 1 month later, she just arrived in June. 1 month later, July 1924, she writes to her parents. Thursday morning, we started from New York, arriving in Spring Green Friday evening. Werner Mosier waited for us at the station with his car. Werner Mosier is the son of Professor Karl Mosier of Zurich. He is tall and slender, has brown eyes and sharply cut features. To walk to Wright would take an hour on an impossible road. We passed a wonderful lake-like river, ascended a curve, and suddenly there we were, without noticing the house. It's a one-story house, quite low, winding around a hill like a snake. Impossible to describe the first impression. Immense astonishment is paramount. Then one becomes somewhat anxious at the thought to be soon in the presence of a genius, to meet him at any moment. And today the air in Taliesin, that's the name of the estate, was charged with electricity. A big industrialist with wife, daughter, and son-in-law were house guests, and it was to be decided whether Wright would be commissioned to build a skyscraper. All his hopes, Wright's hopes, were based on this. And this man is Mr. Johnson, the eventual builder of Scotty's Castle in Death Valley. For weeks, all has been prepared for this visit. The office had been enlarged and annex added for 20 draftsmen. Now Wright came to greet us. He is well built, elegant, of middle height, has an expressive head which could perhaps best be compared to that of Liszt, if one cares to make any comparison. After dinner, we were introduced to the young Japanese architect and his wife, who is also an architect and is as small and thin as a 10-year-old girl. We also met a Canadian who is 7 years with Frank Lloyd Wright, as well as a German who has an 8-month-old child in Los Angeles. He had been all over the world. All these young people have a charming relationship with each other. In reality, they are alone in this world because there are no neighbors, only meadows, forest, sky, and Wright. A great admiration for him unites them all, but a certain state of hate had to be overcome, we were told. He too exploits his employees, although in quite another manner than Mendelssohn. Often they have to work 9 hours, although there's hardly any work. He doesn't like it if they do work on their own. After dinner, the guests were served separately. Wright called us to come in as we were standing as a group outside, not knowing if the master wished us to be with him. We were introduced. Mr. Johnson, who I mentioned, is the eventual millionaire, builder of Scotty's Castle, is an elderly, harmless, benevolent, little, dull-looking man. Very amiable, gracious wife seems to be very superficial. Their adopted daughter, a powdered, pallid, dull-looking female with a doll-like beauty. Her husband had black hair, laughed and smiled, and looked like a nincompoop. Wright sat in an easy chair. It was somewhat painful for us to see such an outstanding man humbling himself by being amiable, offering hospitality in order to get a commission. I was asked to sing. The Steinway Grand was completely out of tune and did not impress me. Imagine me thus sitting at the piano singing Bach Italian arias, and after each song anxiously watching the words whirling around me, smiling friendly when spoken to, although I did not understand a word. If it was a question, I looked imploringly at Richard, who translated it for me. My singing, however, pleased everyone very much. Then I accompanied Mosier to a Handel sonata for violin and piano. He plays very well and praised my accompaniment very much. The main thing was that we helped Wright out of a great embarrassment, because even the best entertainer finds it difficult to entertain these society people in the long run. As to the room itself, I don't know what more to say. It is so immensely many-sided and different, by no means highly modern compared to Taut, but more beautiful than anything I have seen before. Bruno Taut was a highly respected avant-garde architect in Berlin. Then we went into the studio, where Wright fetched miraculous items from his Japanese treasure trove, magnificent painted screens in gold and silver, on which were painted either colored flowers or clouds with birds or dark green fir boughs. Breakfast the next day, Mosier showed us parts of the house which had been built in many periods and has innumerable corners. We came to a basement piled high with books, and imagine now that his magnificent, gigantic edition by Wasmuth rots and molds here in hundreds of copies he bought up to prevent too many people imitating him, we were told. I was quite beside myself and very sorry not to own such a copy. We climbed over the roofs, which are covered with wooden shingles, only slightly sloped. After a drive, we three sat in his room, and when we asked, he showed us his drawings. Mosier had told us beforehand that he loses his drawings due to his disorderliness and carelessness, but supposes nevertheless that everybody robs him, so he is full of distrust. In fact, he began to search, became excited, rummaged in all drawers, and said helplessly, "Everything is gone." Eventually, we got something to look at, and we saw with deep devotion and great admiration how God's spirit and soul are mirrored in this man, with all the mystery of what is beyond understanding. His buildings in Los Angeles are quite marvelous, and this man has nothing to do. Richard said rightly, "What a tragedy that is. He has a wonderful, magnificent office in the most marvelous surroundings, room for 20 people. All the requirements for the execution of commitments which go to those who can't lick his boots. A great part of his drawings have vanished. The Wasmuth edition is rotting in the basement. He sits without work on his wonderful estate, carrying innumerable construction ideas in his mind, probably too beautiful to fit in our world." Then the last bit of her experience at the Wrights. Not mansion, beautiful modernist house. Sunday we took another fragrant walk through the forest, where we found shining red lilies. After our return, Wright asked me to sing in place of a religious service. He liked especially the Bach songs, and you certainly can imagine how wonderful it was to sing in such surroundings. We departed at noon, reaching Highland Park at 1 a.m.
After my parents' visit to Wright, described by my mother that Peggy has read us, Wright wrote to my father in September 1924, "My dear Richard Neutra, $160 per month and your board is what I had in mind. Although in excess of my practice in such matters, I believe you will be able to earn it under the coming circumstances. We'll try it for a while, and if you like it and I like you and all goes well, we will discuss a contract. I'm going to Los Angeles after I return from New York, so you would better come at once to get instructions before I leave Saturday, so you can accomplish something while I am gone." And so indeed they went and lived at Taliesin. And my father wrote to my grandmother, "Today it is a week since Wright left Taliesin for Los Angeles. Sunday, Dione sang Bach for me in the living room. I lay on the couch near the fireplace. It is really marvelous to make music in this room. Since I am here, my admiration for this man has grown even more. He is the greatest living genius as far as I'm aware of. When you experience Wright, you may have an inkling of Bernini. However, 100 Berninis cannot help you to comprehend one modern suffering genius filled with pregnant ideas for the future. He told me once with sad reference to himself the story of a monkey caught and roped on his porch by a planter, and how the monkey bit off the rope and the screen cloth during a long night and went back to the jungle. There he was torn limb from limb because he was different. He had a rope around his belly when no other monkeys had. In 20 minutes it will be 6 p.m. The air is filled with the smell of kerosene lamps, and I write this letter on top of the ground floor plan for Mr. Johnson's house in the desert. No doubt you recall that this skyscraper client also commissioned a desert mansion in California. Wright desires that his building should look like a sprouting cactus. Where shall all of us be when Johnson drives up in his Cadillac to move in? Will his skyscraper be photographed and so become part of our cultural history? All those immense reflecting glass surfaces. Of course, that building was not built by Mr. Johnson. Instead, he went to a Stanford engineer friend of his wife and built a Spanish Revival mansion that today we know as Scotty's Castle in Death Valley. Work continued at Taliesin, but my father decided to move on to California because there was no work. In December of 1924, he wrote, "I talked once more with Wright, told him of our intention to leave in February. Our talk was cordially open, and he was, on his part, most amiable. He agreed to let me go, although he would have liked to keep me and could not understand my motive completely. It appears to me that he will try to postpone my departure on account of office matters, but he could not be friendlier or more cordial. Also, with regard to money matters, he is very fine. That he does not want to stay alone in Taliesin is understandable. Yesterday, I experienced something pleasant. G.A. Reinhardt, the chief draftsman of Hullabird and Roach, wrote me a heartwarming letter which ended with the words, 'God's blessing for you and your family,' adding an excellent reference letter from his firm. As it is the oldest and largest architectural firm in America, it must be considered a success and might prove useful. I am now a member of the American Institute of Architects, thus a legitimate personality." With the considerable experience in the Hullabird and Roach office, and with the inspirational stay with Frank Lloyd Wright, my parents were now poised to move to California and begin their American adventure.